Frank Wilson stood behind the counter of his Clearwater cafe, his fingers drumming nervously on the worn surface. The morning rush was in full swing, but instead of the usual hum of satisfied customers, there was an undercurrent of discontent. Frank's eyes darted from one unhappy face to another, his stomach churning with each disgruntled mutter. "Excuse me," a woman called out, waving her coffee cup. "This isn't what I ordered." Frank forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "I'll fix that right away, ma'am." He turned to remake the order, his movements jerky and rushed. As he worked, he caught sight of the stack of unpaid bills peeking out from beneath the register. The sight made his hands shake, causing him to spill coffee grounds on the counter. "Damn it," he muttered, brushing the grounds onto the floor. He'd clean it up later. Right now, he had to focus on keeping his customers from walking out. As Frank handed the remade coffee to the woman, the bell above the door chimed. He looked up to see Marcus Reed step inside. Marcus was a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark skin and a military bearing. He'd recently returned from his tour of duty, a fact that had been the talk of the town for weeks. Frank felt his muscles tense as Marcus approached the counter. He'd never been comfortable around Marcus, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was the way Marcus carried himself, with a confidence Frank had never possessed. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice deep and steady. "Could I get a black coffee, please?" Frank nodded curtly, turning to pour the coffee. As he did, he overheard a snippet of conversation from a nearby table. "Taking all our jobs. It's not right." Frank's hand tightened on the coffee pot. He glanced back at Marcus, who was patiently waiting for his order. Suddenly, Frank felt a surge of irrational anger. Who did this guy think he was, coming in here like he owned the place? "Here," Frank said, practically slamming the cup down on the counter. Coffee sloshed over the rim, staining the pristine white surface. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Is everything all right, Mr. Wilson?" The concern in Marcus's voice only fueled Frank's anger. "Everything's just fine," he snapped. "Why wouldn't it be? You come in here expecting special treatment?" Marcus's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. I just wanted a coffee." "Yeah, well, maybe you should get your coffee somewhere else," Frank said, his voice rising. "We don't need your kind in here." The cafe fell silent. All eyes turned to Frank and Marcus. In the corner, a woman with short dark hair and a crisp suit, Lisa Brown, though Frank didn't know her name yet, sat up straighter, her gaze sharp and assessing. Marcus stood very still, his face a mask of controlled emotion. "My kind," he repeated softly. Frank knew he should stop. He knew he was making a scene, knew he was saying things he shouldn't. But the words kept pouring out, fueled by stress and prejudice he hadn't even realized he harbored. "You heard me," Frank said. "Why don't you go back where you came from? We were doing just fine before you showed up." Marcus's jaw tightened. For a moment it seemed he might argue. Instead, he simply shook his head. "I think I will get my coffee elsewhere," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Good day, Mr. Wilson." As Marcus turned to leave, the other customers began to mutter. Some looked shocked, others angry. A few nodded in agreement with Frank's words, their faces twisted with the same prejudice. Frank watched Marcus walk out, a mix of emotions churning in his gut. Part of him knew he'd just made a terrible mistake. But another part, the part that was scared and angry and lashing out, felt a perverse sense of satisfaction. The bell chimed again as Marcus left. In the silence that followed, Frank became aware of the many eyes on him. Some customers were already standing, gathering their things to leave. Others were whispering furiously to each other, shooting him disapproving glances. In the corner, Lisa Brown pulled out her phone and began to type rapidly. Frank didn't know it yet, but his actions were about to have consequences far beyond losing a few customers. He'd just set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and his community. As the reality of what he'd done began to sink in, Frank retreated behind the counter, his earlier bravado evaporating. The cafe, which had always been his sanctuary, suddenly felt hostile. He'd crossed a line, and deep down, he knew there was no going back. Lisa Brown sat at her desk in the local Secret Service office, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The events she had witnessed at Frank's cafe earlier that day played on repeat in her mind. As an agent tasked with investigating civil rights violations, she knew she couldn't ignore what had transpired. With a deep breath, she began typing her report. She detailed Frank's hostile behavior towards Marcus, the racial undertones of his comments, and the reactions of the other patrons. As she wrote, Lisa felt a mix of anger and sadness. This wasn't the first incident of its kind she had encountered in Clearwater, but it was one of the most blatant. "Agent Brown," her supervisor called from the doorway. "You look troubled." Lisa looked up, her expression grim. "Just finishing a report on another discrimination case, sir. It's not getting any better out there." Her supervisor nodded solemnly. "Keep at it, Brown. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every report, every action, brings us one step closer." As Lisa returned to her report, she couldn't help but wonder if Frank understood the gravity of his actions. The consequences for him could be severe: fines, mandatory sensitivity training, even the potential loss of his business license. But more than that, she hoped this incident would spark a larger conversation in Clearwater about prejudice and inclusion. Across town, Marcus pushed open the door of the Veterans Corner, a local bar frequented by former service members. The familiar smell of beer and pretzels greeted him, along with the concerned faces of his friends. "Marcus, man, you okay?" asked Jim, a fellow veteran who had served with Marcus. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Marcus slid onto a bar stool, his shoulders slumping. "Had a run-in at Frank's cafe," he said, his voice heavy. "Got told they don't serve my kind there." A hush fell over the group. Then a chorus of angry voices erupted. "That's bullshit! Who does Frank think he is? We ought to go down there and teach him a lesson." Marcus held up a hand, silencing his friends. "No, that's not the way. Fighting hate with more hate won't solve anything." Sarah, an Army veteran with a prosthetic leg, leaned forward. "So what do we do, Marcus? We can't just let this slide." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering. "No, we can't. But we need to be smart about this. We need to show Frank and others like him that we're not their enemy. We're their neighbors, their customers, their fellow Americans." The group fell silent, pondering Marcus's words. Then, slowly, ideas began to emerge. "What if we organized some kind of event?" suggested Tom, a former Navy SEAL. "Something at the cafe to promote understanding?" Marcus nodded, a small smile forming on his face. "That's good, Tom. We could invite veterans from all backgrounds, show the community the diversity of those who serve." As the group continued to brainstorm, their anger began to transform into determination. They weren't just planning an event, they were planning a movement. "We could reach out to local schools," Sarah added, "offer to speak about our experiences, help the younger generation understand the importance of inclusion." Marcus felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. This was what he had fought for, the right for all Americans to live with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or background. "All right," he said, standing up. "Let's do this. But remember, our goal isn't to shame or punish Frank. It's to educate and unite our community." As the veterans dispersed to begin their preparations, Marcus couldn't help but think about Frank. He wondered what experiences had shaped the cafe owner's worldview, what fears or insecurities drove his actions. Understanding didn't excuse Frank's behavior, but it might be the key to changing it. Outside the Veterans Corner, the sun was setting on Clearwater. In homes and businesses across town, people were discussing the incident at the cafe. Some defended Frank, citing his right to refuse service. Others expressed outrage, calling for boycotts and protests. But in a small bar, a group of veterans from diverse backgrounds was charting a different course. They were planning an event that would challenge preconceptions, foster dialogue, and hopefully begin to heal the divisions in their community. As Marcus walked home that evening, he felt a mixture of emotions: anger at the discrimination he had faced, sadness for the prejudice that still existed, but also hope for the potential for change. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for the challenge. Tomorrow they would begin reaching out to community leaders, securing permits and spreading the word about their event. It would be a long process, but Marcus was committed to seeing it through. Because in the end, this wasn't just about one incident or one person. It was about creating a Clearwater where everyone, regardless of their background, could feel at home. Frank Wilson sat at his kitchen table, staring at the official-looking envelope in his hands. His fingers trembled as he tore it open, dreading what he might find inside. As he unfolded the letter, his worst fears were confirmed. The document detailed the fine he was required to pay for his discriminatory actions against Marcus Reed. It also mandated that he issue a public apology and attend sensitivity training. Frank's face flushed with a mix of anger and shame as he read the words. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself, crumpling the letter in his fist. But even as he said it, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that he knew better. He had crossed a line, and now he was facing the consequences. Frank's mind wandered back to the incident. He recalled the look of hurt and disbelief on Marcus's face, the shocked silence of the other customers. For the first time since it happened, Frank allowed himself to truly reflect on his actions. What had driven him to lash out like that? Was it really just about Marcus, or was there something deeper at play? Frank thought about the mounting bills, the declining business, the stress that had been eating away at him for months. He had been looking for someone to blame, and Marcus had been an easy target. As the reality of the situation sank in, Frank felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He had always prided himself on being a pillar of the community, but now he felt like an outcast. How could he face his neighbors, his customers, knowing what he had done? Across town, a community meeting was in full swing at the local recreation center. Marcus stood at the front of the room, addressing a diverse crowd of Clearwater residents. "What happened to me at Frank's Cafe isn't just about one incident or one person," Marcus said, his voice steady and clear. "It's a symptom of a larger problem in our community, but it's also an opportunity for change." The room was silent, all eyes fixed on Marcus as he shared his experience. He spoke about the pain of being discriminated against, but also about his hope for a more inclusive future. As Marcus finished speaking, the room erupted into discussion. Veterans from the Veterans Corner stood up to share their plans for the event at Frank's Cafe. Community leaders offered their support, while concerned citizens asked how they could help. In the back of the room, Lisa Brown listened intently, taking notes. She was impressed by the community's response, but she knew that real change would require more than just good intentions. As the meeting wound down, Marcus found himself cornered by a group of eager volunteers. Among them was Sarah, the veteran he had spoken to at the bar. "We've got everything lined up for the event," Sarah said, her eyes bright with excitement. "Now we just need to convince Frank to participate." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's going to be the hardest part, but it's crucial. This isn't about punishing Frank, it's about bringing the community together." Back at his cafe, Frank was wiping down tables, lost in thought. The place was quieter than usual. Word of the incident had spread, and many of his regular customers were staying away. As he worked, the bell over the door chimed. Frank looked up to see Tom, one of his most loyal customers, walk in. "Evening, Frank," Tom said, his tone cautious but not unfriendly. Frank nodded in greeting, unable to meet Tom's eyes. He busied himself behind the counter, hoping to avoid a confrontation. But Tom wasn't leaving. He approached the counter, his expression determined. "Frank, we need to talk about what happened." Frank's shoulders tensed. "I don't want to discuss it, Tom." "I know you don't," Tom replied gently, "but you need to. The veterans are organizing an event here at the cafe. It's about promoting understanding and inclusion. They want you to be part of it." Frank's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "They what? Why would they want me involved after what I did?" Tom leaned on the counter, his voice low and earnest. "Because this isn't just about you, Frank. It's about all of us, about making Clearwater a better place for everyone. And like it or not, you're a part of this community." Frank was silent for a long moment, his mind racing. The thought of facing Marcus and the others filled him with dread. But a small part of him, the part that had been reflecting on his actions, saw this as an opportunity. I don't know if I can do it, Tom," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom reached out, placing a hand on Frank's shoulder. "It won't be easy, but it's necessary. Change is coming to Clearwater, Frank. You can either be a part of it or get left behind." As Tom left the cafe, Frank found himself at a crossroads. He could continue down the path of anger and prejudice, or he could take this opportunity to learn, to grow, to be better. The choice was his, and it would shape not just his future, but the future of Clearwater itself. The day of the event arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension that hung over Clearwater like a heavy fog. Frank's cafe, usually quiet at this hour, buzzed with activity as volunteers bustled about, hanging posters promoting unity and arranging chairs for the upcoming discussion. Frank stood behind the counter, his hands shaking as he wiped the same spot over and over. He had agreed to participate in the event, but now, faced with the reality of it, he felt overwhelmed. His eyes darted nervously from face to face, searching for signs of hostility or judgment. The bell over the door chimed constantly as people filed in. Frank recognized many of them, regular customers, local business owners, and faces he knew from around town. But there were also unfamiliar faces, people drawn by the promise of open dialogue and the chance for change. As the cafe filled, Frank's anxiety peaked. He considered retreating to the kitchen, hiding from the crowd and the consequences of his actions. But before he could move, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Tom, the loyal customer who had convinced him to participate. "Deep breaths, Frank," Tom said, his voice low and reassuring. "Remember why we're here. This is your chance to make things right." Frank nodded, swallowing hard. He knew Tom was right, but that didn't make it any easier. At precisely 7 p.m., Marcus Reed stepped up to the makeshift podium at the front of the cafe. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the man at the center of the recent controversy. Marcus surveyed the crowd, his gaze lingering for a moment on Frank. Then he began to speak, his voice clear and strong. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. We're here because something happened in this cafe a few weeks ago. Something that hurt not just me, but our entire community." Frank felt his face burn with shame, but he forced himself to keep listening. Marcus continued, "But we're not here to point fingers or assign blame. We're here because Clearwater is better than what happened that day. We're here because we believe in the power of understanding, of empathy, of coming together despite our differences." As Marcus spoke, sharing his experiences both as a veteran and as a black man in America, the tension in the room began to dissipate. People leaned forward in their chairs, nodding in agreement or wiping away tears. "I've seen the worst of humanity during my time in the service," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I've also seen the best. I've seen people from all walks of life come together, put aside their differences and work towards a common goal. That's what I want for Clearwater." Throughout Marcus's speech, Frank stood rooted to his spot behind the counter. Each word hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions and their impact. As Marcus finished speaking, a round of applause filled the cafe. Then, to Frank's surprise, Marcus turned and gestured for him to come forward. On shaky legs, Frank made his way to the front of the room. He could feel every eye on him, could sense the mix of curiosity and skepticism in the air. For a moment he considered turning back, fleeing from the judgment of his community. But then he looked at Marcus, saw the openness and lack of hostility in the other man's eyes, and found the courage to speak. I don't really know what to say," Frank began, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. "What I did, what I said to Marcus, it was wrong. I was scared and stressed, and I lashed out at someone who didn't deserve it." Frank paused, taking a deep breath. "I've lived in Clearwater my whole life. I thought I knew this town, knew the people in it, but I realize now that I've been seeing only what I wanted to see. I've been blind to the experiences of people different from me." As Frank spoke, he felt something shifting inside him. The words that had been so difficult to start were now flowing freely, fueled by a desperate need to make things right. "I can't take back what I did," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "but I can promise to do better. To listen more, to try to understand, to make this cafe a place where everyone, no matter who they are, feels welcome." The room was silent as Frank finished speaking. For a moment he feared he had said the wrong thing, that his words weren't enough. Then slowly, people began to applaud. It wasn't the thunderous ovation that Marcus had received, but it was something, a sign that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for redemption. As Frank stepped back, feeling drained but somehow lighter, Marcus approached him. Without a word, Marcus extended his hand. Frank hesitated for just a moment before grasping it, the handshake serving as a silent pledge. To do better, to be better, to work together for a more inclusive Clearwater. The event continued late into the night, with community members sharing their own stories and experiences. As Frank listened, he began to see his town and himself in a new light. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope for the future. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the cafe shifted. What had started as a tense gathering evolved into an open forum, with community members stepping forward to share their own experiences with discrimination. Lisa Brown, the Secret Service agent who had witnessed the original incident, stood up. "I've seen a lot in my line of work," she began, her voice steady. "But what happened here, in our town, hit close to home. It made me realize that we can't just rely on laws and regulations to change things. Real change has to come from within our community." Her words seemed to open a floodgate. One by one, people began to speak up, their stories painting a complex picture of life in Clearwater. An elderly Asian woman described the subtle racism she'd encountered over decades of living in the town. A young Hispanic man shared his experiences of being unfairly targeted by local law enforcement. A transgender teenager spoke about the challenges of finding acceptance in a conservative community. Frank listened to each story, his expression a mix of shock and growing understanding. He'd lived in Clearwater all his life, but he was realizing how little he knew about the experiences of many of his neighbors. As the stories continued, Frank found himself thinking back over his life, examining his own beliefs and behaviors. He thought about the jokes he'd laughed at, the assumptions he'd made, the times he'd looked the other way when he saw something that made him uncomfortable. When there was a lull in the sharing, Frank surprised himself by standing up again. His voice shook as he began to speak. I want to thank everyone for sharing their stories," he said. "I know it can't have been easy, and I want to apologize not just for what I did to Marcus, but for all the times I've contributed to the problem without even realizing it." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I grew up here in Clearwater. My parents grew up here. I guess I always thought I knew what this town was about, but listening to all of you, I'm realizing how much I've been missing." Frank's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I can't change the past. I can't undo the hurt I've caused, but I can promise to do better going forward, to listen more, to question my own assumptions, to speak up when I see something wrong. As Frank sat down, he felt drained but also strangely invigorated. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. The conversation continued late into the night. People who had never spoken to each other before found common ground. Ideas were shared for making Clearwater a more inclusive community, from diversity training for local businesses to community events celebrating different cultures. As the event wound down, Marcus approached Frank again. "Thank you," he said simply, "for hosting this, for listening, for being willing to change." Frank nodded, unable to find the words to express the tumult of emotions he was feeling. But as he looked around the cafe, at the groups of people still engaged in earnest conversation, he felt a glimmer of hope. The next morning, Frank arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. As he unlocked the door, he paused, looking at the space with new eyes. This wasn't just his business anymore. It was a part of the community, a place where change could begin. He started his usual routine, brewing coffee, setting out pastries, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the stories he'd heard, the promises he'd made. How could he turn those words into actions? As the first customers of the day began to trickle in, Frank greeted each one with a newfound awareness. He found himself really looking at people, really listening to them, in a way he never had before. Mid-morning, Marcus walked in. Frank felt a momentary pang of anxiety, but he pushed it aside. "Good morning," he said, meeting Marcus's eyes. "What can I get for you today?" Marcus smiled. "Just a black coffee, please." As Frank prepared the coffee, he realized that this simple interaction, serving a customer, exchanging pleasantries, was the beginning of something new. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was real. It was a step towards the change he'd promised to make. He handed Marcus the coffee. "Here you go," he said. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, "And Marcus, thank you for giving all of us, the chance to do better." Marcus nodded, his expression serious but not unkind. "That's what community is about, Frank. We all have to look out for each other." As Marcus left, Frank turned to greet his next customer, feeling for the first time in a long while that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but he was ready to walk it, one step at a time. In the weeks following the community event, Frank's cafe underwent a transformation that was more than just cosmetic. The atmosphere had shifted, becoming more welcoming and inclusive. Frank had taken the first steps towards making good on his promise to change, and the effects were beginning to show. One sunny morning, Frank stood behind the counter, surveying his cafe with a sense of pride and purpose. The walls, once adorned with generic landscape prints, now featured a rotating gallery of local artists' work, showcasing the diversity of talent in Clearwater. A community bulletin board near the entrance was filled with flyers for cultural events, support group meetings, and educational workshops. Frank had also initiated a series of coffee and conversation nights, where community members could come together to discuss important issues in a safe, moderated environment. The first few had been tense, but as people grew more comfortable sharing their experiences and perspectives, real dialogue began to emerge. As he wiped down the counter, the bell above the door chimed. Frank looked up to see Marcus entering, accompanied by a group of veterans from various backgrounds. "Good morning, Frank," Marcus called out, a warm smile on his face. "Got room for a few more?" Frank nodded, gesturing to a large table in the corner. "Always room for you folks. What can I get you?" As Frank prepared their orders, he overheard snippets of their conversation. They were discussing plans for a support program for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. Frank found himself listening intently, struck by the challenges many veterans faced upon returning home. After delivering their drinks, Frank hesitated for a moment before approaching the group. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, his voice tentative. "This program you're planning, is there any way I could help?" The veterans exchanged surprised glances before Marcus spoke up. Actually, Frank, there might be. We've been looking for a regular meeting place, somewhere comfortable where vets can come together, share experiences, maybe get some job training. Frank nodded eagerly. You could use the cafe after hours if you'd like. Free of charge, of course, and, well, I'm always looking for good help around here. If you know any vets looking for work, send them my way. The offer was met with enthusiastic approval from the group. As they continued to discuss the details, Frank felt a warmth spreading through his chest. This was what community was supposed to be about. People coming together, supporting each other, making a difference. Over the next few months, Frank's cafe became a hub for the veteran support program. Tuesday and Thursday evenings saw groups of veterans gathering for meetings, job skills workshops, and simply to enjoy each other's company in a welcoming environment. Frank found himself looking forward to these evenings. He enjoyed chatting with the veterans, hearing their stories, and seeing the positive impact the program was having on their lives. He even hired a few of them to work part-time at the cafe, their presence adding to the growing diversity of his staff. One evening, as Frank was closing up after a particularly lively meeting, he found himself alone with Marcus. As they stacked chairs and wiped down tables, a comfortable silence fell between them. Finally, Marcus spoke. "You know, Frank, what you're doing here, it's making a real difference." Frank paused, leaning on the back of a chair. "I'm just trying to make things right," he said softly. Marcus shook his head. "It's more than that. You're not just making amends, you're actively working to make this community better. That takes courage." Frank felt a lump form in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without you, Marcus. Without everyone who was willing to give me a second chance." As they finished cleaning up, Frank's mind wandered to how much had changed in just a few short months. The cafe that had once been a flashpoint for tension in the community had become a symbol of what was possible when people came together with open minds and hearts. Just as they were about to leave, the bell above the door chimed. Frank looked up, surprised to see Mr. Johnson, the owner of the hardware store down the street and one of Frank's oldest rivals in the local business community. "We're actually closed, Mr. Johnson," Frank said, trying to keep the wariness out of his voice. Mr. Johnson nodded, his expression unreadable. "I know. I just wanted to have a word with you, Frank. In private, if possible." Frank exchanged a glance with Marcus, who nodded reassuringly. "I'll head out," Marcus said. "See you tomorrow, Frank." As Marcus left, Frank turned to face Mr. Johnson, bracing himself for whatever was coming. He had a feeling this conversation was going to put his newfound commitment to openness and understanding to the test. As the door closed behind Marcus, Frank turned to face Mr. Johnson. The older man's face was a mask of neutrality, but there was a tension in his shoulders that put Frank on edge. "What can I do for you, Mr. Johnson?" Frank asked, gesturing for the man to take a seat at one of the recently cleaned tables. Mr. Johnson remained standing, his eyes scanning the cafe. "You've made quite a few changes around here, Frank," he said, his tone difficult to read. Frank nodded slowly. "Yes, I have. It was time for some improvements." "Improvements," Mr. Johnson repeated, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "That's one way to put it. But I've got to wonder, Frank, all these new programs, these diverse faces, is this really what Clearwater needs?" Frank felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he used to get when confronted with change. But now, instead of giving in to that discomfort, he took a deep breath and considered his response carefully. "Mr. Johnson," he began, "I used to think I knew exactly what Clearwater needed, but I've learned that our town is more diverse, more complex than I ever realized. These changes, they're not just about improving my business, they're about making our community stronger." Mr. Johnson's eyebrows rose. "Stronger? By catering to outsiders?" Frank shook his head. "They're not outsiders. They're our neighbors, our customers, our fellow citizens. And by excluding them, we've been hurting ourselves as much as we've been hurting them." As Frank spoke, he could see Mr. Johnson's expression shifting from skepticism to something closer to curiosity. Encouraged, Frank continued, sharing stories of the positive changes he'd seen, the connections that had been made, the lives that had been improved. By the time he finished, Mr. Johnson's rigid posture had relaxed somewhat. "I'll admit, Frank," he said slowly, "I came here tonight planning to tell you that you were making a mistake, that you were betraying the Clearwater we both grew up in." Frank nodded, understanding all too well where Mr. Johnson was coming from. "And now?" Mr. Johnson sighed. "Now, I'm not so sure. Maybe there's something to what you're doing here. Maybe Clearwater has room to grow." As Mr. Johnson left the cafe, Frank felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. It hadn't been an easy conversation, but it felt like progress. One more mind-opening, one more step towards a more inclusive Clearwater. The next morning, as Frank was preparing to open the cafe, he noticed a sleek black car pull up outside. A woman in a crisp suit stepped out, Lisa Brown, the Secret Service agent. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson," she said as she entered the cafe. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Frank shook his head, gesturing for her to take a seat at the counter. "Not at all. What can I do for you, Agent Brown?" Lisa's expression was serious as she pulled out a folder. "Mr. Wilson, I'm here because we've received some concerning reports. It seems that the incident here a few months ago wasn't isolated. We're conducting a broader investigation into discriminatory practices in Clearwater." Frank felt his heart sink. Just when things seemed to be improving, the past was coming back to haunt him. "I see," he said quietly. "And what does that mean for me?" Lisa's expression softened slightly. "That depends, Mr. Wilson. We've also heard about the changes you've made here, the programs you've implemented. We're interested in hearing your perspective on what's been happening in Clearwater." Frank nodded slowly, his mind racing. This was his chance to not just make amends for his own actions, but to help address the larger issues in his community. "I'll tell you everything I know," he said firmly, "and I'll do whatever I can to help make things right." As Frank began to share his experiences, both his past mistakes and his recent efforts to change, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. This investigation might be challenging, even painful, but it was necessary. It was another step towards the kind of community he now realized he wanted Clearwater to be. By the time Lisa left, promising to be in touch, the cafe was beginning to fill with the morning crowd. As Frank turned to greet his first customer of the day, he caught sight of his reflection in the polished coffee machine. The face looking back at him was older, more lined than he remembered, but there was a clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Frank knew he was ready to face them. Not alone, but together with the community he was only now beginning to truly know and appreciate. The investigation into Clearwater's discriminatory practices loomed over the town like a storm cloud, but it also catalyzed a surge of community activism. Frank, determined to be part of the solution, decided to take a proactive approach. He reached out to Marcus with an idea for a town-wide event to address the issues head-on. 2 weeks later, Frank's cafe was packed to capacity. The tables had been pushed aside to make room for rows of chairs, facing a makeshift stage at the front. People from all corners of Clearwater had turned up. Long-time residents, newcomers, people of various races, ages, and backgrounds. The air buzzed with nervous energy. Frank stood at the podium, his hands gripping the edges tightly as he surveyed the crowd. He spotted familiar faces: Marcus, Lisa Brown, Mr. Johnson, and many others he'd come to know over the past few months. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We're here today because our town is at a crossroads. We can either ignore the problems that have been brought to light, or we can face them head-on and work together to make Clearwater a place where everyone feels welcome and valued." As Frank stepped aside, Marcus took the stage. He spoke eloquently about his experiences as a black man in Clearwater, both the challenges he'd faced and the positive changes he'd seen recently. His words seemed to resonate with many in the audience, prompting nods of understanding and murmurs of agreement. Other speakers followed, community leaders, longtime residents, and newcomers alike. They shared stories of discrimination, but also of hope and progress. Each testimony added another layer to the complex picture of life in Clearwater. Lisa Brown took the stage next, providing a broader perspective on the investigation. "This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame," she emphasized. "It's about identifying areas where we can do better and working together to implement changes that will benefit everyone in Clearwater." As the event progressed, Frank was struck by the raw honesty of the testimonies. People were opening up in ways he'd never seen before in Clearwater. There were moments of tension, certainly. Some audience members shifted uncomfortably or muttered in disagreement, but overall there was a sense of genuine engagement and willingness to listen. Towards the end of the event, an elderly woman Frank didn't recognize took the microphone. Her hands shook slightly as she spoke, but her voice was clear and determined. "I've lived in Clearwater for over 70 years, she began. "I've seen this town change in many ways, some good, some not so good. But what I'm seeing here today, this openness, this willingness to confront our problems, this gives me hope for the future of our town." Her words seemed to crystallize the mood in the room. As she finished speaking, there was a moment of silence, followed by a thunderous applause. As the event wound down, people lingered, forming small groups to continue discussions. Frank moved among them, listening, answering questions, and feeling a growing sense of optimism. "Mr." Johnson approached him, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Frank," he said, "I didn't think this town was ready for something like this. But seeing everyone here today, maybe we're more ready than I thought." Frank nodded, a small smile on his face. "We've got a long way to go," he admitted, "but this feels like a good start." As the last of the attendees filed out, Marcus joined Frank at the front of the cafe. "That went better than I expected," Marcus said, his tone a mix of relief and satisfaction. Frank agreed. "It did. But now comes the hard part, turning all of this talk into real action." Marcus clapped a hand on Frank's shoulder. "We'll figure it out together. That's what community is all about, right?" As they began to clean up, Frank's mind was already racing with ideas for next steps. Community workshops, policy reviews, outreach programs. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long while, he felt genuinely excited about Clearwater's future. The investigation might have started as a threat, but it had become an opportunity, a chance for Clearwater to confront its past, address its present, and shape a more inclusive future. And Frank was determined to be at the forefront of that change, one conversation, one action at a time. In the months following the town-wide event, Clearwater began to undergo a subtle but significant transformation. Frank found himself at the center of this change, his cafe serving as a hub for community initiatives and discussions. One crisp autumn morning, Frank stood outside his cafe, watching as a group of volunteers hung a new banner across Main Street. "Clearwater celebrates diversity," it proclaimed in bold, colorful letters. He felt a swell of pride, remembering how far they'd come in such a short time. Inside the cafe, Frank was busier than ever. He'd expanded his menu to include dishes from various cultures, each with a small placard explaining its origin and significance. The walls now featured a rotating exhibit of artwork from local artists of diverse backgrounds. As he wiped down the counter, Frank overheard a conversation between two regulars, an elderly white woman and a young Hispanic man. They were discussing the upcoming cultural festival, debating which performances they were most excited to see. Frank smiled to himself, recalling a time not too long ago when such a conversation would have been unthinkable in his cafe. The bell above the door chimed, and Marcus walked in, accompanied by a group of teenagers. They were part of a new mentorship program that paired veterans with at-risk youth. Frank had offered his cafe as a meeting place for the program, and it warmed his heart to see the positive impact it was having. "Morning, Frank," Marcus called out. "Mind if we use the back room for our meeting?" Frank nodded, gesturing them through. "Go right ahead. I'll bring some snacks in a bit." As Frank prepared a tray of pastries and fruit for the group, he reflected on how much his relationship with Marcus had evolved. From that tense confrontation months ago, they'd become not just allies in the push for change in Clearwater, but genuine friends. Just as Frank was about to take the snacks to the back room, the cafe door burst open. Mr. Johnson stormed in, his face red with anger. "Frank!" he bellowed. "We need to talk, now!" Frank set down the tray, his heart sinking. He'd known that not everyone in town would be happy with the changes, but he'd hoped that Mr. Johnson at least had come around. "What's the problem, Mr. Johnson?" Frank asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Mr. Johnson slammed a newspaper down on the counter. "This is the problem," he growled, jabbing his finger at an article. "Your little diversity crusade is costing us business. Tourism is down 15% this quarter. People are saying Clearwater isn't the same anymore." Frank took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation. "You're right, Mr. Johnson. Clearwater isn't the same anymore. It's better." Mr. Johnson scoffed. "Better? We're losing our identity, our traditions. All for what? So you can feel good about yourself?" Frank felt a flash of anger, but he pushed it down. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd been learning to handle differently. "Our identity isn't static, Mr. Johnson. It grows and changes as we do. And our tradition of hospitality should extend to everyone, not just those who look like us or think like us." He picked up the newspaper, scanning the article. "Yes, tourism is down slightly. But have you looked at the other numbers? New businesses opening up, property values rising, crime rates falling. Clearwater is thriving, Mr. Johnson. And it's because we're finally tapping into the full potential of all our residents." Mr. Johnson opened his mouth to argue, but Frank held up a hand. "I know change is hard. I struggled with it too, remember? But I've seen the positive impact these changes have had on our community. Why don't you come to our next town hall meeting? See for yourself what we're building here." For a moment, Mr. Johnson looked like he might continue arguing. But then his shoulders slumped, the fight seeming to go out of him. "Maybe I will," he muttered. "Someone's got to speak up for the old Clearwater." As Mr. Johnson left, Frank let out a long breath. These confrontations were never easy, but they were necessary. Change didn't happen overnight, and not everyone would be on board right away. But Frank was committed to seeing this through, no matter how challenging it might be. He picked up the tray of snacks and headed to the back room, where Marcus and the teenagers were waiting. As he pushed open the door, he was greeted by the sound of laughter and animated conversation. This, he thought, was what the new Clearwater was all about, and it was worth fighting for. The Clearwater Town Hall was packed to capacity, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. At the front of the room, Frank stood at the podium, his heart racing but his resolve firm. This was the moment of truth, the culmination of months of hard work and difficult conversations. "Good evening, everyone," Frank began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "We're here tonight to discuss the future of Clearwater. But before we do that, I think it's important to acknowledge our past." He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw familiar faces: Marcus, Lisa Brown, even Mr. Johnson sitting in the back, his arms crossed, but his expression attentive. "A few months ago, I stood in my cafe and said words I'm deeply ashamed of. I let fear and ignorance guide my actions, and in doing so, I hurt not just one person, but our entire community." A hush fell over the room as Frank continued. But that moment, as painful as it was, became a catalyst for change. It forced me and many of us to confront the prejudices we'd been harboring, sometimes without even realizing it. Frank gestured to the diverse crowd before him. "Look around you. This is the real Clearwater. People from all walks of life, all backgrounds, all experiences. We've always been diverse, but now we're finally starting to embrace that diversity as our strength, He outlined the changes that had taken place over the past few months, the new businesses opened by minority entrepreneurs, the cultural exchange programs in schools, the community policing initiatives that had dramatically improved relations between law enforcement and minority communities. These changes haven't always been easy, Frank admitted. Change never is, but the results speak for themselves. Our economy is growing, our crime rates are down, and most importantly, our community is stronger and more united than ever before. As Frank stepped back from the podium, the room erupted in applause. But he knew the real test was yet to come. The floor was opened for questions and comments, and Frank braced himself for what might come. The first to stand was Mr. Johnson. Frank tensed, expecting another confrontation. But to his surprise, Mr. Johnson's tone was thoughtful rather than combative. "I've lived in Clearwater my whole life," Mr. Johnson began. "And I'll admit I was scared of all these changes at first. I thought we were losing something, but I've been watching and listening, and I'm starting to think that maybe we're not losing anything at all. Maybe we're gaining something instead." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. More people stood to speak. Newcomers who shared how welcoming Clearwater had become, long-time residents who spoke of their evolving perspectives, young people excited about the town's future. As the meeting wound down, Lisa Brown took the stage. "As you all know, our investigation into discriminatory practices in Clearwater is ongoing," she said. "But I want to commend this community for the proactive steps you've taken. You're not just addressing the symptoms, but working to cure the underlying issues. It's a model that other towns could learn from." Her words sent a ripple of pride through the room. Frank felt a lump forming in his throat. They still had a long way to go, but they were on the right path. As people began to file out of the hall, Marcus approached Frank. "You did good up there," he said, clapping Frank on the shoulder. Frank shook his head. "We did good," he corrected. "All of us, together." Just then a young reporter approached them. "Mr. Wilson," she said, notepad in hand. "The changes in Clearwater have been making headlines. There's talk of the town receiving a national award for community integration. How does that make you feel?" Frank paused, considering his words carefully. "It's not about awards," he said finally. "It's about building a community where everyone feels valued and respected. We're not perfect. We still have work to do, but we're committed to doing that work every single day." As the reporter jotted down his words, Frank looked around the emptying hall. He thought about the journey they'd been on, from that terrible day in his cafe to this moment of hope and possibility. Clearwater had changed, yes, but so had he. And as he stood there, surrounded by the community he'd come to know and love in a whole new way, Frank Wilson knew that the best was yet to come.